Hi, and welcome to the chapter about the Isolani. What is an Isolani? Well, it's defined with the pawn we see here on d4. You can see it's separated from the two other pawn blocks we have. So, well, that's really the defining thing, that it's a pawn that's isolated, that can't be helped by any of its other pawns. Is that good or bad? Well, it's a great question, and we're going to debate that a lot in the coming hours. When I see a position like this, and I see it from the white perspective, I mean, it might sound strange, but I'm always already thinking I'm going to give mate to his king on g8, because, well, what I see here is not, from White's perspective, a weak pawn on d4. I see a lot of attacking possibilities. Basically, one can feel tremendous energy from the white side. I mean, well, we have rooks in open files. There is e1 and c1 for them. But I would almost say more defining. My knights have great squares where they can jump to. Even this one can maybe jump further. My bishop maybe on b3, maybe on d3, where it will sort of attack against the king. And my queen, I will somehow, try to get to the king side and give mate. There is even sophisticated ways, like let's say a4 and a rook to a3, and sort of switching it to the king side, maybe also via the d3 square. But you can see that for me, the position really starts springing to life. And especially also a lot of the time, this pawn on d5 that, well, you will consider it weak, but very often we can sacrifice it with d5 and even blow up more open files. So, well, what I'm really hoping for in the sort of this chapter and in the, well, this course in general is that when you see a bare structure like that, you will not see just 12 pawns sort of put out on a chessboard. No, you will start to see that this is a landscape, and it's a landscape where you can sort of see the hills, or rather the flow of energy. And well, that when you see this, it becomes clear to you that White is gonna aim at a king at g8, or he's gonna aim at pushing the pawn forward. That this is sort of the typical contours in this kind of landscape. Then, of course, there will be differences pending specifics. But also, I mean, now I said all the nice things I think with White, but let's try and reverse it, right? If we have the perspective from Black, how do I see it there? I see it completely differently. I mean, I would think, whoa, he has a weak pawn on d4, and my structure is incredibly solid, right? I'm going to defend well, and then I'm going to really put pressure on him in the end game. When I look at this position, I would say I have a very nice square for my knight on f6. Maybe I can put my bishop out to b7. Then I'm going to completely control the square on d5 so that he never can push d5 himself. And I'm not that afraid of his attack. So I'm just going to make some exchanges, and everything is going to end up with a horrible ending like that. And we will also see that, are these ending horrible? Well, they can be pretty bad in a way. So I would say both from the white perspective and from black's perspective, I start having this feeling of how is the pieces moving. Well, I mean, maybe my knight on b8 is going to go to c6 and a5, or to b4, or even sometimes like this. We have a lot of ingrown patterns when we see a certain structure. And I think it's pawn structures that really are defining. And when we know how the pawns are, we immediately start seeing energy and the direction for our pieces. And well, that's the concept of the whole book. And for this chapter, it's going to be a debate about the pros and cons of the isolated pawn. I hope you will learn something, and I hope you will have fun on the way there. We're going to start off with a game between Zvagintsev and Vasquez. And I think it's a great game because it gives perfect illustrations of a white strategy that just works incredibly well here, and it explains the sort of basic understanding from White's perspective of Isolani positions very well. It's from a game from 2013 played in Hanti-Mansisk. Hanti-Mansisk is a special place for chess players. It was almost the chess mecca at some point. There was a lot of World Cups happening there, and even this one is from a World Rapid Championship. But I think for most other people, Hanti-Mansisk might be a skiing locations, but most would just think it's a city deep inside Siberia. But for chess players, it's something quite special. Anyway, back to chess. The situation we see here is a very typical Isolani position, right? I mean, well, the defining thing is the pawn on d4, and it can be weak, it can be strong, and we will have a better understanding of that when we finish the chapter, hopefully. It's a very, I think, straightforward positions in terms of, you can see that the light the light pieces has gone to very natural squares, right? I mean, the knights are on its very sort of typical places, and so are the bishops. I mean, both players perhaps have difficulties developing this bishop. At sight, you would argue, it's black bishops that's weak and white's is good. But actually, it is kind of important to understand in this position that bishop g5, which at least to me looks like a very, very straightforward and natural developing move, is actually a step in the wrong direction. Black would play the move h6, bishop h4, and then knight h5. This kind of leads to very helpful exchanges from black's perspective. I mean, now the threat is here, right? And well, of course you can go back, but then the knight is going to eliminate it, and black will be fine. And if you take on e7, we're going to take back, and well, this knight will fall back here, and there will still be control of the d5 square. And, well, mainly black has managed to exchange a set of minor pieces. With black having less space, exchanges are generally favorable. So while this position is seen quite commonly, it's actually seen from the Queen's Gambit, the decline, where the bishop goes to g5 early. Putting it there voluntarily now would actually be seen as a mistake, because exactly of this maneuver, h6, bishop h4, knight h5, somehow leads to very helpful exchanges for black. I think even with the rook on c1 in this position, with white just having an extra tempo, it becomes a game between Anand and Andreev in the very early stages of me being Anand's coach. And well, I think Anand said, what should I do about this? And I said, okay, come on, Vishy, it's a well-known position and you have an extra tempo. And he was telling me that, yeah, I can count too, but it would be more helpful if you could tell me what I should actually do. And there he had a reasonable point. And I think generally this maneuver with the knight going to h5 is very important in this specific structure, and very helpful from black's perspective. So here, in our original position, you would not see them trying to develop this bishop immediately. In some sense, it's quite well placed on c1 already. The good move here is the move a3. I hope it will look a little bit weird, perhaps, but it's kind of useful. It gives the bishop the possibility of going backwards like this, which is both helpful in terms of, well, knight a5 would be a typical way to harass the bishop, but now it can just back safely. And also, well, what should black do next here? A very normal plan would be to play a6 and then, well, gain space with b5, and then, the bishop can go to b7 next, right? It becomes very harmonious, or at least it looks like that. So this is what Vasquez does in the game, but it really turns out horribly. So bishop goes to a2. Well, you can argue it's some kind of prophylaxis. I mean, black is going to play b5 next, so, well, we get ready for that. And as we can see in the game, it actually stops b5. And black should do something else. But I think the author also points out that in this position, there is like more than 100 game, and almost 50 of them continue with b5. Because this is the very logical way for black to develop, right? And, would black get the time? He's doing quite fine. And I think that's also a key thing to understand, this kind of Isolani positions. It's like black is trying to set up his I don't know if fortress is the correct way, but he will develop his pieces and be ready to sort of counter White's initiative. But sometimes White can strike early, and here he can do it by playing d5. It leads to an exchange at first sight, and generally, I guess the argument would be why, well, White is just trying to make a draw, right? He just got rid of his isolated pawn. That's very logical if you consider the weak pawn, but basically it's considered a drawing mechanism, right? You can see the pawn structure now has become completely symmetrical. But actually, it is much, much worse for Black than it seems. I mean, well, White would threaten to take the pair of bishops. Actually, Black should really live with that. He should play the move rook to a7, and something like bishop e3, rook d7 takes the here. White just have a pair of bishop. He's, as we would say, he's clearly slightly better in terms that it's obvious White is better, but also Black has somehow limited the damage. And here, I think with good play, he should be able to make a draw. But, well, of course, Black's idea is not just to be worse in a boring position. So the logical move here, and the move by far the most has played, is knight takes d5. But now comes a very impressive move. Queen takes d5. It would be considerably worse to take with the bishop, although I guess for most this would look very logical. But then Black can actually sort of start developing like this, and no immediate harm is going to happen. Queen takes d5 is much more powerful. The key point is that, well, it looks like, you know, Black can just exchange queens, right? But after queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, there is an imminent collapse because we are threatening this knight, and you can't move it because then something is going to hang on a8, and if you defend it, well, then there is this very simple tactics, takes and here, and game over. So suddenly the situation is much, much worse for Black than it seems in terms of, well, it's only an optical illusion that queens are coming off. The natural move is bishop b7, as was played in the game. And now Black does threaten to liquidate take on d5, put the bishop on f6, rook into open files, and we will gradually make a draw. But it's White to move, and he plays the clever move queens to h5. Well, what has happened here? The Isolani has disappeared. Of course, from a defensive perspective, we can say that's great. We don't have a weak pawn anymore. But the very relevant part, I think, is that the queen has been transferred to h5. And it's actually a very, very strong piece on h5. Somehow, I would argue that this pawn structure, I think it's considered, I think Karpov said this is the perfect pawn structure in front of the king. But it's kind of bare there. There is no, specifically there is no knight on f6, which means that the queen can actually stand on h5 and be very strong. And, well, this queen is actually, it's a very strong attacking piece, as we will see. And you can't really expel it. If you start playing something like g6, it would happily go to h6, and there's going to be knight jumps to g5. You then have to give up your bishop, but then you will have huge problems on the dark squares. If you instead would try something like h6, well, it's not great either. You can take it and then give a check on here. And I think that the simplest way is just to try and give mate on h7. When they play f5, you return to h2. And like this, you're going to pick up the rook on f7, and it's obviously over. So this queen on h5 is extremely annoying, and White is actually close to winning here. I hope that at first sight that will see somewhat puzzling for you, but there's no reasonable way to defend the king's side. And basically, it's a mixture of well, this bishop being very strong, somehow the queen on h5, of course, being strong in combination with that, and then White will be able to transfer the next wave of attack to the king's side, and actually Black is extremely badly placed to sort of defend that. The game continued queen c7. Now the author, well, the game is bishop g5, and the author praises that. The computer kind of claims that a move like bishop d2 is even stronger. A rook will come to c1, and knight g5 will happen. It's going to be great. But I think either way, it's just a very bad position for Black. The game was takes, knight takes h6, and now I think a very, very nice move. He plays the move rook to e3, just simply bringing a piece into the attack. Well, we will see what the threat is next move, so I'm not going to spoil it here. I think the computer says that now the absolutely only way to defend is knight to e5, and then white can play something like knight e6, fe6, and rook takes e5. Next, we're going to win the e6 pawn, but there is certain drawing chances. You are a clean pawn down, but then your weakness has somewhat disappeared. You can put a rook on f6. Maybe if you play perfect chess, you have a chance to draw. But of course, it's a horrible prospect for black. But actually, it's better than being mated immediately, obviously. So knight a5 happens, and now Zvagintsev plays a very beautiful move. He just plays the move queen to g6. That's, well, it's possible because we have a pin here. And now, of course, we're threatening queen h7 mate. But, well, black obviously takes, and then comes the move rook to h3. And, well, basically, the threat is obvious, right? We're going to go queen h7 and mate. Should you choose to play the move rook to f2 e8, then the nice way to finish things are rook to h7. It threatens mate on g7, right? And if queen e5, then it's made into check and mate like this. So Vasquez, I mean, I think he is a kind of famous online chess player, so he actually tries the last trick that exists in the position. He plays the nice move rook f to c8. Now rook h7 also looks extremely crushing, but it's a good example of you have to stay observant till the end, because here there is the very sneaky move queen c1 with back rank mate. Well, Zvagintsev doesn't fall for that. He plays the move rook to e1. And, well, that basically threatens check here, and after king f8, queen h8 mate, and there's no reasonable way to defend against this. So in this position, Vasquez resigned. Well, this is a very model game, and I think let's do some kind of autopsy and see what was it exactly that went so wrong. We're gonna go back to the starting position. Isolanis can happen from a lot of ways. This happens, well, c4, c6, transposition into a Caro-Kann. It becomes the so-called Panov system, and we get a fairly standard position here. White plays bishop c4. Sometimes the bishop will go to d3 instead, but both are quite reasonable. I would argue that the first misstep for black here is that he plays the move knight to f6. That's a little bit back and forth, right? And it's considered a dubious move by now. Of course, you will see scenarios where there is a black knight on f6 and black has taken on c4, and the bishop then arrives at c4. But then normally the tempos would be better for black. So going back and forth like this, I think it's somewhat suboptimal. The correct move from theory is probably the move bishop to f6. And it sort of increases the pressure on the Isolani, right? And should white choose to play the move knight to e4, then you can, for a start, you can retreat the bishop, but also the computer is arguing you can play the move b6 and taking on f6. Well, sure, it gives white a pair of bishops, but also it has, well, it's made an exchange that is quite decent from black's perspective. He will go bishop b7 next, and so on and so forth. It's not too bad. That's considered sort of a better way of doing it. After knight f6, a3, the author makes a point of that in this position, b6 is a considerably stronger move. His main point is of a tactical nature. He argues that, well, d5 can happen, and let's say now you use this possibility of playing knight a5 to win a tempo on the bishop, and when the bishop goes back, we goes for a general swap down like this, and now there is the move bishop e6, and even if something like, something like this, I guess you would at times even win a pawn, like something like this, you can see that, well, black is going to have two open files as compensation, and also there's a knight coming to b3, and very typically this kind of compensation generally leads to a draw. White will probably have to return a pawn, and black is supposed to be fine. So he's suggesting that the move b6 is quite good here, but Modern computers are somewhat less impressed. They just want to, back with the bishop to a2, and after bishop b7, they make this move bishop to f4. And well, first for me, I thought, okay, why is this actually good? But it turns out to be very reasonable. I guess the main point is that after bishop d6, well, for a start, we could consider going to g5, and now at least there is a pin, and he cannot do this h6 and knight h5 sort of swapping maneuver I spoke about. But even more interesting, the computer says bishop e5 is a very nice move. And that at first I thought, okay, this is somewhat puzzling. But, well, it's actually rather nicely played there. I guess, it is annoying, right? I mean, suddenly we might take on f6 and play d5, or we might take and play knight e4. Black has to stay somewhat observant. He can't, he can go knight to e7, but then at least he has to consider we take an f6 and double his pawns. And should black choose to take here, then let's say you can't really start swapping down and put a knight somewhere like this, because a move like rook d7 is going to be annoying. So strangely, in this position here, bishop d6, bishop e5, I thought it's a very useful and interesting concept. And in this specific position, it seems to be very nice having a bishop. You understand? It will happen extremely rarely, but well, it's useful to understand. And we will go queen e2, rook a d1 if black doesn't really try to disturb us immediately. And well, somehow. I think the author has a point that instead of a6, as we saw, did very badly in the game, b6 would be better, but it's actually not great. And I think the real culprit, if we go back to rook e1, knight f6 here, is it's too much. I mean, black is still solid, but white is ahead tempo-wise, and we saw that illustrated well in the game. So we start off with a game here where we really see white's perspectives, and we see that white can quite often actually exchange in the center and use this to his advantage. So, I mean, the d5 break, don't see it only as a drawing weapon. I mean, if you are, let's say, with colors reversed, black would often try to play d4 and swap down to a draw. But from the white perspective, d5 can actually be a very aggressive attacking move, and Swaginchev showed us that in an excellent fashion. Our next game is Husman against Aronian from Plovdiv 2010. It's a very nice game, but quite different from the previous one in terms of that here black uses the Isolani in a somewhat more unusual way, I would argue, and that's actually quite typical of Aronian. Aronian we all now know as a world elite player for plus 10 years, but I used to play with him in the Bundesliga. We played for the same team, and well, even before he was high rated, he still kind of, acted like a star. I mean, well, I was higher rated than Aronian at the time, but of course he would play board 1 for our team. I mean, he was Aronian after all, right? And but somehow he was capable of banging it up with the action. I mean, in the evenings we used to play blitz, and I think at some point he beat me 10-0, right? And well, how can you not have someone who beats you 10-0 play above you in the team? It doesn't sort of no, he was a little bit arrogant, but in a very funny and friendly way. And I think we all got to appreciate him both as a person, but also as a very creative player. And he basically made it to the top in the world. At some point, he was considered almost favorite for some world championship tournaments, but they didn't pan out for him. But he's been a sort of loved character in the top of the chess world for plus 10 years. And this game shows his strengths very well. He's having the black pieces here, and well, you can say it looks like a fairly typical Isolani position, but perhaps, I mean, this knight on d7 is somewhat oddly placed, and maybe also we would argue that bishop at d2 and queen c2 is a little bit weird. Husman's next move, a3, is just, it's kind of a misunderstanding, but perhaps at the time, this line was not developed so well, and black takes back with the bishop on c5. A very I mean, you could argue that maybe the knight would like to take back on c5, and that is exactly why Husman chose to play a3. But I think later Carlsen himself in this position played the move e3 against Ivanchuk, and it became a more balanced position. Basically, you can see that well, white is just saving on not having to play this move a3, right? Anyway, back to our main game. So a3 takes, e3, and Aronian plays a6. That's a quite useful move. I mean, we saw it in the previous game. You sort of you get space for the bishop here, you get it out of the way, and that can be quite useful. But actually, the computers is suggesting that, well, you should play the move queen to e7 here, and after bishop e2, knight d5. It generally looks illogical. Why should black start swapping pieces? I mean, well, I think the general concept is that when you have an Isolani, you want to attack, so you want to keep a maximum of pieces on the board to sort of use your space advantage and cramps black's position. But here circumstances are just pretty favorable for black, and the computer says after castling bishop to g4, black is already actually slightly better. And well, you can grasp the logic. I mean, we are threatening to take on f3, leaving him with a double pawn. And should he take here, we're going to take back with the queen, right? And, well, keep exchanging doesn't really work, because then we're going to have a mating threat on h2, which is going to be uncomfortable. We have to start playing g3, but then queen h5, we have to play h4. That's not nice. Next, perhaps we would back with the bishop to d6, so sort of again threatening on h2. Somehow, in this position, the development works well for black, and I would also argue that well, these pieces start to be more misplaced, and it's not like black will succeed with an immediate assault on the white king side in terms of it's gonna be made, but white will have to make some unpleasant concessions, and the computer just says you know, it's pleasantly better for black. But Aronian played the move a6. After bishop e2, he played b5, getting some space, castling bishop to b7. Generally, I guess we would make a case for that the bishop doesn't really belong here, right? It's shooting into your own isolated pawn. Of course, we are dreaming of releasing, this one and opening the diagonal like this. But, well, the d4 square is extremely well protected, right? Right now, it seems unlikely that we will carry through this thing. So obviously, white's concept is very much to try and stop that. But looking a little bit deeper, I think the bishop gets, a little bit out of the way. You start connecting the rook. And as you see in the game, there is a potential for d4, but also it's just somewhat developed there. And while, it could perhaps be better on g4 or some kind of other square, b7 is actually not that bad at all. Husman now starts playing under the wrong assumption that he's slightly better. What he should have done was to realize that actually black is perfectly fine here, and he should play the move b4, bishop d6, and then a4, basically trying to swap down on the queen side. I mean, he wants to assure that I would almost say that all these four pawns disappear, and it becomes a very, very, very drawish structure like this. I think computer is giving something like this: rook to c8, queen up here, and maybe something like this. And I think soon we can expect some kind of exchanges where, I don't know, b4 would fall, or they will play b5 and there will be an exchange, and it's going to lead towards a likely draw. But Husman is still, under the impression that he's doing pretty fine. So he plays rook fd1. Aronian, well, that's another benefit of having the bishop on b7, that the c8 square became available. It's, of course, eyeing the queen in this file. It's not going to be of any particular relevance soon, but even so, it's useful. Bishop e1, rook e8, rook a to c1. And this position, I think, is a little bit interesting. And it's also interesting that I think Aronian's next move is extremely logical, but the computer says it's somewhat suboptimal. He plays the move knight to f8, and it works beautiful in the game. I mean, you're trying to transfer your knight to e6 or even to g6, and you're basically developing it on the side where, well, you're supposed to attack your opponent's king, right? But the computer and also the author of the original book points to that knight b6 is actually a very strong move. You're gonna put the knight on c4. Should they go knight d4 immediately? Well, you can jump to c4 already. And it's a pretty useful piece there. And I think part of it, why it's so useful, is exactly because the pawns are put like this. You cannot really play b3 and get rid of the knight, because then a3 would be hanging. And if you play a4 yourself, then black can push with b4. And suddenly, this knight on c4 is going to be a considerable nuisance to white, right? There's no reasonable way to sort of eject it. And I think, well, it combines well with the bishop on b7. I mean, you would never really consider taking on c4, because we're going to take with the d pawn and really open up for the bishop, which is going to be great like this. And it's just, it becomes very unpleasant. So I would say knight b6, it's a very interesting concept. It's basically, well, you're surrendering the d4 square. You're saying, okay, I don't care, you have control over that, but then you start playing around it. And I think we see it quite often with when white has the Isolani, this happens. But here, you could do it in a very similar way. And the computer thinks black is just comfortably better. And I think a lot of it has to do with these two bishops, right? They are somewhat passive. And also, while maybe, you know, it can feel somewhat passive that all our pieces are protecting this pawn, it is very well guarded, and white really has nothing else going for him except for this pawn, right? There's no way to naturally develop the white pieces. So I really thought that, you know, the knight on b6 is a very, very interesting theme here, jumping to the c4 square, but perhaps it's somewhat specific based on this pawn structure. And when we see even a creative player like Aronian chose to do the knight to f8 instead. Here, Husman keeps playing like he thinks white is slightly better. He should really do b4 now and then just try to get things exchanged on the queen side. He could even be moderately better. The computer is giving something like this. We take on b4, takes here, and let's say swap down like this. And I'm sure black is supposed to draw this rather effortlessly, but we cannot argue against that white is slightly better, right? There is the square here on d4. b4 would have been a much, much better move, but Husman plays the move knight d4. I mean, Husman is a very well-respected player and especially well-respected coach. He was the coach of Gelfand for a long time, including his absolutely best years. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with his chess understanding at all. He's a really great player. But here he is a little bit too optimistic and gets punished by a young Aronian. So queen goes to b6. And, well, again, you see this very clear logic in white's plays. I mean, he's managed to occupy the square in front of the Isolani. He thinks the pawn here is weak, and he pushes a bishop up, attacking it. A very logical narrative. Unfortunately for Husman, it's also wrong. Better would be something like, let's say, queen to d2, and after knight e6, basically Aronian starts dissolving his isolated pawn. I mean, there is threats against d4, right? So knight takes e6 would be logical, and here, well, you could even consider taking with the pawn and removing your sort of Isolani on d5. You can also just live with the Isolani and play, I think, queen takes e6 instead. That will also be very reasonable. You still have sufficient activity, and you have a knight jumping to e4. I mean, we're not debating white advantage at all. Even so, this would have been preferable. But Husman chose the move bishop f3, and Aronian's next move is very, very nice. He plays bishop takes d4. I mean, normally you would think, whoa, you're going to give up your bishop for a knight here, even on this sort of important d4 square. But I think it was Fischer who said, right, don't look at what goes off the board, look at what remains. And what remains here is that, well, you don't really want to take with the pawn, right? If you take with the pawn, it becomes sad. Now suddenly there's no Isolani anymore. You're going to have a bad bishop on e1. Black is just pleasantly better here. So, of course, Husman took with the rook. But then knight e6 happens, and suddenly Black starts to release the potential of his position, right? I mean, the knight here is threatening to take on d4, obviously. But more importantly, when this rook disappears, he's going to push d4 next. Husman chose to go to d2, and logically d4 happened. Husman is a bit unlucky here because he's actually, calculated things quite well. I mean, his idea is that he can play bishop takes b7 in this position. And this tactic, taking on c3, takes on c8, takes back, it actually works because suddenly now there is protection of the bishop on c8 and white has an extra pawn. But unfortunately for him, after bishop takes b7, Aronian has judged it better. He just takes back with the queen. And when he takes the pawn on d4, sure, it has become a pure pawn sacrifice. But Black's compensation is brilliant. He plays the move knight to e4. Well, it hits the rook, right? So this logically has to go back. And after rook d to d1, he plays the move knight f4. This threatens knight takes c3, followed by queen takes g2 mate. This is quite simple to see. But after the move d5, at first sight, you get the impression it's not too bad. Well, unfortunately, they can win an exchange like this, but even here, well, we have a strong bishop, we have a pawn on d5, at least we're gonna fight on for a while. But you get this impression of Aronian's confidence when he doesn't take the exchange. He actually plays this very nice move, a5. He simply starts to undermine. He's threatening the move b4, and suddenly this is much more than the black position can take. The white position can take. He plays queen b3, but after b4 takes, you're undermining the e2 square under much more profitable circumstances. I mean, well, you take on e4, it doesn't really make a difference. We take and we give a check and take like this, and it's completely game over. The knight on e4 and the pawn on d5 is going to be hanging in this kind of sequence. So Husman played the move knight to a2, and just a check happened, and he took the rook, and basically, like this, it's hopeless. We can stop here, and Aronian won a very great game. I think from a chess perspective, we learned quite some things in terms of that. Even this kind of very, I would say, different kind of, let me have a position like this, that a different kind of Isolani structure where it doesn't look at all like you will carry through the move d4. It can actually happen anyway. And part of the reason that this happens anyway is, I would say, the inactiveness of the white position, that just being able to block the black initiative in a very direct sense is not enough. You also need to have some kind of play on your own. And I think this position illustrates it quite well, because white's position is very solid. You can see decently reasonable functions for all his pieces, but he lacks any kind of positive play. So just blocking the isolated pawn is not really enough. I think also we got to understand that the bishop on b7, well, it looks silly, but somehow it's a bad bishop protecting an important pawn, and somehow having d5 covered, it means that Aronian could sort of regroup around it and then start to attack. So I thought this was a brilliant game. And, well, for me personally, perhaps also it was a lesson in that, well, you can be a great coach like Husman, but when you start getting a little bit older, you will get horribly pounded by the young players. So I haven't played a chess tournament for 10 years, and this is perhaps a little bit of the reason that I'm not too keen on being beaten up instructively by young kids. I would much rather do videos for you. Here we have a game between Wojtaszek and Fressinet. It's a very interesting endgame, but I would like to talk a little bit about the two players first, because not only are they two very close friends of mine, they are colleagues for 10-15 years. Wojtaszek, who plays the the white pieces was an integral part of Anand's team, and so was Fressinet for Carlsen's team. And as long as Magnus was, competing for the World Championships, I was working very closely with Fress. I hope I'll be able to talk about both of them at some point during this video series, but here I will, use the opportunity to diss Fressinet a little bit, or Fresh as we call him, because, I mean, in this kind of World Champions teams, you will always find some kind of competition to a certain extent. And I think with me and Fressinet, there definitely was very, I would say, friendly tension in terms of I think we both thought that we are the clearly better chess player than the other. Not in practical terms, but let's say in kind of chess understanding in a way. And result-wise, I have absolutely nothing to back it up with, because Fressinet is one of the luckily few players that I have lost to every time I've played against him. And he's just a stronger practical player than me. There's not much to say there. But when I say stronger practical player, you can always feel that I'm starting to defend that my chess understanding is better than his. So in that sense, this is a very great game fragment, because Fressinet basically have a very sad position here. And it's good to have friends who like Wojtasek, who can uphold my general understanding of Fressinet, where I'm completely incapable of doing it myself over the board, right? Anyway, why is this such a nice position for white? Well, we have the Isolani, which is here generally just a weakness. We have reached the endgame stage, and the general point of the Isolani is the activity that comes with it. But for this activity to be relevant, you need to have more pieces, ideally also the queen, in order to actually sort of construct an attack against the king on g1. But that's obviously not going to happen here at all, right? I mean, black doesn't have any relevant attacking resources, so basically this is a purely defensive task for black. To make things even worse for black, white possesses the open file, and he has a nice knight on f4, which is ideally placed to attack the pawn on d5. So Fressinet goes to move rook to d7, and basically now I think it becomes a position where black is just doomed for passive defense. And that is quite interesting from our perspective, because we're trying to understand generally how are these kind of Isolani structures. And you could very well make the argument that if this was an easy draw for black, then having an Isolani becomes very pleasant, because you get the attacking chances. And should you, unfortunately end up in a worse ending, it's an easy draw. But it's not an easy draw, and this you will see here. So Wojtasek plays a nice move. He plays d4. It starts sort of, insinuating at some point we will play g5, and start kicking the knight away, attacking this pawn. But we're not necessarily going to do it immediately. It's just, it's a mixture of posing the threat of g5, but also gaining space. And because there's no queens, because there's limited material left, I mean, playing a move like g4 is not at all weakening the position of your king. So Fress plays the move h6, and Wojtasek plays the move f3. Very sort of nice. The king goes to f2, it covers the e4 square, and you can even start pushing further on the king's side. Fressinet has no choice, just to defend passively. And the next move I really like from Radek here. He plays the move rook c to d1. At first sight, it seems a little bit weird. Why are we going to give up the open file? But he's now having three pieces attacking the pawn on d5, which means there is no choice for black but to allocate the same number of resources defending it. So basically, while it does give up the c file, it doesn't really do it anyway. And the game continues logically. g6, now king f2, king g7, and h4. Now it starts insinuating this move g5, undermining the knight on f6, and when you undermine the knight on f6, then you're undermining the pawn on d5. Maybe it's not a direct threat, because of a g5 takes, you could play knight h7 and start attacking a pawn on g5. But it is unpleasant. One could have a general philosophical discussion. Is this position a draw or is it winning for white? Most likely with perfect play, it could still be a draw, but it has very little practical relevance. I think it was Larsen who at some point said that, I mean, what matters is to have winning chances in the ending. If it's winning or not is somewhat less relevant from a practical perspective, right? We're not playing correspondence chess. We can all see that it's very unpleasant. Black has to play a bunch of precise move in order to survive, and that is very difficult. I mean, you could in principle make the same discussion about the starting position. I think we all think that it's a draw by perfect play, but so what? It's a practical game. We try to put pressure, and hopefully we're going to succeed. And here the conditions are very good. Black has to defend extremely well. He chooses to play the move g5 now, which obviously is a concession. You could also try to go rook c8, and the slight hope is that should they start taking on d5, we're going to have counterplay with rook c2 check, right, and the pawn on b2 would fall. But white would just play the move rook to d2, and then start renewing threats like g5, or even the threat of e4, sort of using the pin in the d file. And, well, black is more or less forced to go back with the rook to d8. So, I mean, of course, playing a move like g5 is not pleasant, but it's generally forced sooner or later here, and Fresnel chooses to do it now. So takes, knight to e2. I guess we should also talk about, well, what is the downside of having a pawn here? Well, you just managed to expel the knight from here. Isn't that positive? And yes, that's positive. But, well, you know, when you get something, you often lose something. And here you lost control of the f5 square. So that could be a knight jumping to f5 at some point, which could be very inconvenient for black. Fresnel actually plays a nice and quite typical defensive move. He plays the move knight to g8, and after knight d4, knight e7, the knight is both defending this square, but also it's defending the weak pawn on d5. Actually, sort of in this kind of Isolani endings, the e7 square, it's quite often a useful square for the knight. I think it's seen in some, when it arises from the French, we have seen a player like Dolmatov actually quite consistently drawing similar endings, although less worse than this one. I mean, on e7, I would argue the knight, it's more stable, right? On f6, as we saw, white could try and undermine it with g5 threats. Here on e7, at least it can stand there more or less as long as it wants. So this also leaves the question of how should white proceed here? Well, Wojtaszek does it nicely. He plays the move king to g3, basically enjoying his space advantage, meaning the king can be a little bit more out in the open. But also after rook h8, he starts pushing the move f4. I guess you could argue generally white doesn't really want to exchange pawns. I mean, when you are ahead in a positional sense, you want to not do too many exchanges, because exchanges generally favor the sort of defending player. But it's also like, if you need to win a better position, you have to break some kind of holes. And, well, for that, exchanges can be necessary in a way. And I think, well, I think also, I keep referring to Larsen, but that's my sort of mentor and an idol, that he says that, well, the process of breaking down your opponent's position, there might be times where it looks a little bit ugly. And maybe this is one of the places. I think it would be possible to take like this, but the nice thing about this exchange is now that the e file sort of becomes open. So let's say a6, something like rook e1. It is also a very pleasant position. This idea of, you know, a theoretical debate, is this a draw, is it a win? I think it makes little sense. It's obviously a very pleasant position for white. There's even the slight tactical trick of rook takes e7 here. So Fresnel plays king to g6. Now maybe Radek should actually have played f5 check and kept more sort of pawns on the board, but he plays the move knight to f3 instead, and is also quite reasonable. You have to take on f4 now, let's say f6. Well, that becomes a very simple tactical trick. So it takes on f4 and takes back. f6 defends the e5 square, and now f5 check, king f7, rook e1. Again, a beautiful position for black, but still somewhat solid. And it becomes the struggle of, can black hang in enough? Can he make sure that there's enough exchanges so that when white finally breaks through, there might not be enough firepower left? Rook c7 happens, knight d4, a6, rook d3, knight c6, trying to swap a pair of knights. Obviously, he's not going to allow that, but after rook e7, he plays the move g5. And, well, I said it earlier. When in the process of trying to break through, there's going to be some exchanges allowed at some point. He takes here on g5, and now actually Radek makes a miscalculation. He could have played rook takes e7, and in this position after king f6, probably he missed that there was this very nice move, king to g4. And while Fresney can take the pawn on f5, it's extremely temporary. You give a check, and then you're going to pick up the knight on f5. Radek chose to play king g4 instead, and well, here after rook h1, I think now there was the strong move, rook e4 check, king takes g5, rook to e3, and black creates counterplay just in time. I think basically this phase illustrates quite well what I was talking about, that well, white has a much better practical position. It's borderlining winning, borderlining black can draw, and it just becomes an interesting struggle. It's going to be decided of who plays best. But this debate about, well, this being a simple draw for black, not at all. It's obvious that white has great prospects in practical terms, and it's just a very pleasant chess game from white's perspective. And we see it here that now d4 happens, and after takes here, there is this very nice move, king to e4. We're threatening a check here. It's basically horrible, and I think the game was d3, check, king f7, and now a very nice move, rook to h3, and it's just going to win the pawn on d3, because you can't really go rook d7 because of rook h7 check, king e8, knight f6. So basically here, well, he just won the pawn, and after d2, rook d3, Fresney choose to resign. I think a great example and a great game, and what I like about it is also it doesn't leave a very sort of clear conclusion. I mean, well, can I tell you white is winning here? Not at all. Can I tell you black can make a draw here? Definitely not either. What I'm trying to tell you is that it's an incredibly pleasant position for white. It's not a safe haven at all for black. And as we saw, I mean, well, Radek played it brilliant. With g4, he put a lot of pressure. And this is what you dream of playing against the Isolani, that you want to, you know, remove your opponent's attacking potential. Then you get a pleasant ending, and then you play it well and win. And Wojtaszek did it brilliantly. I will continue sort of showing some of the great examples from the book of how the Isolani actually is quite a serious weakness in the end game. And well, if you think why am I focusing so much on the end game, well, that is actually an integral part of understanding the problem of the Isolani. And I think the author here does a very good job of showing different kind of constellations that illustrates what is it the one fighting the Isolani is actually aiming for. It's a game between Korneev and Kasimdzhanov. And, well, Kasimdzhanov is also a colleague of mine from Team Vichy. We spent ages sort of preparing Vichy together. And I think in a later video, maybe let him introduce him as a coach. But as this is the first time I mentioned Kasimdzhanov, I think it's more respectful to tell that Kasimdzhanov is the former world champion. He actually won the World Knockout Championship in Tripoli. A big surprise at the time, I think, to most players, because he was considered a good player, but not one of the best. But there he really showed what an amazing chess player and especially an amazing competitor he was. And he managed to beat Topalov in the semifinal. Topalov was playing incredibly well in this tournament. I think he had 9.5 out of 10 after the first 5 rounds. But Kasimdzhanov did it brilliantly. He kept him sort of to 2-2 in the in the regular games, beat him in tie breaks, and he's. I mean, because he's such a good coach, perhaps he's a little bit underestimated as a player and a world champion. But he's a really, really strong player. And in this game, you get to see and feel his chess understanding. So, basically, we have an Isolani position here, right? There is a weak pawn on d4, and the first task is to fix it. So the move c6 is very logical. Korneev now plays b4. As we will see later, this becomes a crucial weakness, but there's not much you can do about it anyway. And I think also the book explains it nicely. It says that, let's say you wait like king h2, then you do like this, and after something, when you have sort of organized your pieces like that, the stuff starts coming the threat of c5. And the only way to deal with that is to play b4. So why not do it immediately? For our perspectives, we get kind of the ideal situation we want to discuss quicker. So queen d8, a3, and now I think a very nice move for black. I really, really like. It's nothing special, but it shows, I mean, we would say good chess culture to a certain extent. He plays the move h5. Why is that so great? Well, it gains space. You can see later he will play g6, king g7, putting everything a little bit more aggressively. But mainly, I would say it also addresses this pawn structure. And it wants to put the pawn at h4 at some point, maybe. I understand it's vague, but at least for me, it's very obvious that, well, h5 is a great move. It's sort of, it insinuates certain things, and also in this position, well, time is kind of on black's side. There's no particularly hurry. I mean, well, we would rather have the rook on d5 than on d6, but they cannot stop us from doing it. So why not play h5 now? I think, no, h5, it's just a very useful move. It improves the position, and we are in absolutely no hurry to do harm to black. I mean, we are just gonna make things better so that when we are trying to do sort of some aggressive things, then we are ideally set up. So basically, we are shaping the situation to be as perfect as possible before we're going to strike. So queen f4 happens, g6, he puts the queen on e5. It looks nice there, but if anything, it just gives us a tempo when we sort of going to put our rook at the ideal square. So queen e4, king g7, king g1. I mean, you can argue now both sides have set it up kind of ideally the way they want, right? I guess one should mention the king on g7. Is it slightly unsafe in terms of, well, would it be safe on h7 or g8? Maybe on g7 you can imagine checks happening on the dark squares, but also black is in some kind of situation of power here, so he can actually allow to have his king a little bit closer to the center. Perhaps also, well, should the queen comes off, as we see, the king might want to run to the center at some point. It's definitely not a factor immediately, but because black has everything under control, because it's black who's putting pressure, you can allow you to play some kind of luxury moves like this. Anyway, what's next now? Well, the problem is that this Isolani is the general weakness, but it's very, very hard to get at it further. White played the move b4, and that had the sort of indirect consequence that it stopped the undermining move c5, which means that d4 pawn is not as weak as we would like it to be. But there is the clue also that, well, b4 has now become a weakness, and Kasimdzhanov immediately goes at it. He plays the move a5. It's not something that, heavily makes black's position collapse, but it makes it weaker in a way. You could also have tried to, let's say, very straightforward. He played b6. The idea is simple. You want to go c5 next, and you're going to collect this pawn. But this creates some kind of counterplay. You could play something like, let's say, queen e2. It attacks the pawn on a6. After rook takes d4, you suddenly realize, okay, there was a downside to having the king here. The computer gives something like c5. Let's say takes, and now queen takes a6, rook takes d4. It's equal material, but it's still kind of unpleasant. Let's say rook e1, c4. You know, the c pawn is quite strong. The white king might be a little bit exposed, but probably things has clarified too much, and we have been helpful for white here. So in this position, I think Kasimdzhanov's move is stronger. He plays the move a5. Again, as we have spoken about previously, it does allow exchanges, but I think from black's perspective, exchanging a pawns has the effect of making the b4 pawn weaker. So it's quite an relevant ingredients here. Probably, well, he plays king h1. He just waits. It would probably have been better to take on a5. And, well, let's say something that we can take back. But you can start playing a move like rook d3. And somehow you are hanging in there. You're trying to defend your two weaknesses after something like queen d8. There is a threat of c5. But then you can switch to some kind of active defense. Rook b3. And if b5, then after rook b4, it's actually going to be very difficult to break down break down white's defenses. But again, like in the previous example, we are not making the argument that black is winning by force. We are making the argument that the white position is extremely unpleasant to play. And we saw that Konev decided, no, I'm just going to wait. Let's see what's going to happen. So Kasimdzhanov exchanges and now plays the move queen to d6. And suddenly, well, this b4 pawn is very, very unpleasant. There's not much you can do to defend it. He tries with queen b1, rook b5 happens. Well, he tries queen a1. The idea is if you take the pawn, then something like d5 check is going to give some amount of counterplay. Kasimdzhanov steps out of the way. Queen goes to a2. He steps back here. And after queen a8, he plays the move queen to f8. Actually, I think the author is a little bit too critical of Kasimdzhanov's play. I think the modern computer says, no, this ending that happens now is actually still very winning. So the game goes on like this. We see that the black king is much closer to the center. So king g1, king d6, king f2. And now, actually, well, Kasimdzhanov goes on to win the game, but the author makes an interesting point here, that after king d5, king e3, king c4, it's surprisingly difficult to win after rook c1 check, king takes b4, and now the move h4. You're gonna get counterplay with g4. I mean, at first sight, to me it looks, this must be completely winning for black, but actually, the king is not very well placed on b4. I mean, you cannot play, let's say you play rook d5, there's going to be a check, something on b7 is going to drop. It is surprisingly awkward in this position, and the move g4 is going to create a lot of trouble for black. Kasim won anyway, but I think in terms of just for chess understanding, we should go back to this position and see what the computer says. And the computer says that if you play the move h4, it's basically strategically bust. We're going to do this next. And should the king, I mean, if we do the exact same line, something like this, well, then you don't have the move h4 followed by g4. And I think we can just start retreating our king a5 to b6. We'll put the rook on g5. And it's a completely hopeless scenario for white. So h4 here is... I mean, a nice touch. I'm sure that perhaps Kasimdzhanov was low on time and he won the game anyway, so no big harm done. But that would have made it even a more perfect example. But I think generally summing up, same conclusion as in our previous example in this kind of scenarios. Endings are going to be very unpleasant for the one with the isolated pawn. Unless he can basically sort of draw instantly, he's in for a very, very hard defense. If the position is objectively drawn, objectively winning, is impossible to tell, but also it lacks practical relevance. There is considerable winning chances, and it's much more pleasant for the one to play who fights against Isolani. And well, we saw it here in the game. White has some chances, but it's black who puts pressure. It becomes very, very difficult. So I think a great example by the author and great play by Kasimdzhanov. I think this is a quite cool feature of the book that, well, the author sort of is playing around with general understanding, and he just had an example that was almost the same, right? He had a pawn on c6 there, but now he moves the pawn to e6 to try and understand, is this just as pleasant for the one playing against the Isolani, or does it make any kind of difference? And I think this is kind of how chess understanding develops, that you become curious and you start experimenting. He doesn't have a concrete game here. I actually think there is an old game of Kortnoy against Karpov from the World Championship match in Baku. But I think this example is even clearer. So it's actually a pretty good choice that he decides to sort of put it up himself. We see White playing f4 here in his example. And well, that's very logical, because kind of a part of the winning process is that should White just stay calm, at some point Black will play e5 and basically just undermine the weak pawn. Right here you can reply to d5, but Black's concept is playing rook d5 anyway, and that will sort of make the threat actually real. So he chooses to play f4 immediately. It has a funny, I would say, mirror image similarity to the previous example. Right there, we wanted to stop c5 by playing the move b4, and here, well, it's basically the same. You play f4 in order to stop e5, but like the previous example, the cure is the same, but also the side effects are extremely similar. The computer actually has a very interesting idea to try and do it differently. It suggests playing the move queen to c2. The idea is that, well, let's try and create some kind of counterplay here. Well, for instance, if you take a d4 immediately, well, then takes, we have a check, king to h7, and queen takes b7. This basically becomes an instant draw. White has sufficient counterplay, he's not down a pawn, and there's nothing reasonable, Black can do. It's basically, it's just, I think, well, the cleverest thing would just be to take a draw by perpetual, by giving a check here, and next the king goes to h2, you're gonna give a check here, and it's gonna be an instant draw. So after queen c2, we have to do it differently. Generally, it makes sense to strengthen your position first. So I'll say going g6 felt quite natural, but then the White idea is quite clever. It is rook to d3. It's not so much a passive idea in terms of, well, you could argue you will switch the queen to d2 and defend like that, but that's not the point at all. After rook d5, White goes rook to b3, and it starts eyeing the pawn on b7, and this is somewhat awkward. But Black's best, I think, is just to go queen to d6, and after rook takes b7, rook takes d4. It's an interesting sort of way that I would say advantages has transformed, right? I mean, suddenly, well, from a structural point of view, White has sort of done very well. He got rid of his weak pawn without losing it, or he exchanged it for the pawn on b7. The problem, however, is that his king on h1 is really, really insecure. It's perhaps a bit surprising, but I think it comes from this rook on b7. Well, if you could sort of get it back to f1 or any kind of square in the second rank, it would just be a draw. But like this, simply, there is bank rank problems, and there's no reasonable way to defend it. The only thing you actually can do is you can give a check, king goes to g7, and then the nice move queen to c3. It sort of pins this away, and it exploits that should you play e5, which would be extremely logical, then you don't have the threat of queen or rook d1 mate anymore, because the white king can just go to the h2 square. And this means that in this position, there actually is the very nice move, queen to c7. And somehow, well, White is certainly still in trouble here, but he's trying to hang in quite well. So after queen c3, I think the computer is giving this nice move g5. It's generally creating space, but also you want to go with your king out of the pin, and then you want to renew the mating threats. And it's still a very unpleasant position for White, no doubt. I think it's borderline on sort of, can it be drawn, or is winning? I think we're sort of this kind of gray zone there. And I think it also goes to explain that when you have to, actually be creative to create something that's, not necessarily drawable, but at least you have some chances. It gives away how big the edge is here, just in this kind of almost symmetrical position, except for the isolated pawn. Anyways, f4. So standard moves, queen back to d8, getting ready in the d file. White moves the king, and this one comes again, the h5 move. I think it's a very nice move because, well, part of it is wanting to have the pawn on h4. I would say it fixes an unfortunate pawn structure. But having the pawn on h4 also basically ensures that the pawn on f4 is going to be a permanent weakness. And you can't really go g3 yourself to protect it, then you will go f4. So basically, by playing h5 and h4, black ensures that there are two potential weaknesses to start attacking. And when you go from one weakness to two weaknesses, things get considerably worse, because you cannot just give all your energy to defending one of them, because then typically they can attack the other one. So here, it's really unpleasant for White already. Queen to b4, just queen d7, not making sure that b7 doesn't drop. And the author makes a couple of standard moves. Queen to d2, h4. And he goes on with suggesting reasonable moves, attacking the pawn on h4, right? But we can defend it and do something useful at the same time. Our queen would relocate to f6, where it eyes both the weaknesses. And I think the author stops here after b3, rook f5, basically saying that it's going to be a very difficult defense with defending both these things at the same time. For a start, I think we have the threat of g5, which is actually going to win a pawn. And it's very hard to suggest anything reasonable. Let's say something like rook f1. You can play queen to f6. That renews perhaps the threat of this. Maybe not, you can take it. But it's going to be very unpleasant. And maybe we will start expanding a bit on the queen side. Maybe we play g6, king g7. I think we are in this territory where it's almost borderline lost for White, or at least in a practical game, it becomes extremely difficult. The examples we are showing you here, we can see that the defending side seems to crack under pressure. And I think also that is very much what normally happens. So I think a cool example here from the author, right? Sort of playing around with our understanding of keeping to reinforce the image that an isolated pawn, it is often an asset. It's fun to have an isolated pawn. You can really attack with it, and you will see a lot of games where White wins, or sort of the one having the isolated pawn will win in a great fashion. We started the chapter with two of these. But it's also very important to understand that you are running strategic risks, and that if your initiative actually comes to a halt, if things starts getting exchanged, you can be in for a very difficult and tedious defense. But, well, that's kind of reasonable, right? You want the upside, you have to be able to suffer the downside. And that's probably why, isolated pawn situations is very interesting, because they offer a lot of prospects for both sides. This is a game from 2013 between Simacek and Jobava. And it's a great game, and it illustrates Jobava's style very well. Jobava, I think, took the world of chess with storm, maybe even some 20 years ago, when we suddenly would see some incredible attacking games coming from a young Georgian player. We had no clue who was. Now, well, we had him around in the world of chess for 20 years, and we'd gotten used to seeing this kind of, I would say, almost extreme character, because some point he will play a amazing games, pushing sort of the limits on how we think chess can be played, and other times it will go less well, obviously. You can't sort of live that much on the edge and be successful all the time. I mean, generally, he will tend to almost violate principles, or perhaps he was just modern before it became, even cool to be modern in some way. A very interesting player and also a very interesting person in many ways. But well, let's focus a little bit on the chess game he has here a bit more than 10 years ago. It's a pretty typical French Taras situation. So basically, I mean, black has this isolated pawn as the theme of our chapter, and white is kind of ready to jump to b3 and sort of control the d4 square. And well, that's what he does. White plays knight b3 and the bishop goes to b6. Generally, it looks like an extremely typical position, but there's actually a major detail compared to the normal kind of Isolani French structure, where the knight has been committed to the move knight e7 already. This is not the case here, and this makes a major difference. And I remember in my youth, I was trying to get the same trick in that Jobova does very successfully, just from, let's say, a c3 Sicilian, but a similar structure. And it made a huge impression on me, this general concept, and it was something I tried to implement and quite successfully. It's hard to believe, but in this position, the move bishop e2 is actually a major inaccuracy. You should play the move bishop to d3. And, well, the reason is that now knight e7 kind of is the correct move, then castles bishop g4, rook e1, e8, 6, h3, bishop h5, c3, knight c6, bishop e3. It basically becomes an incredibly typical Tarrasch French, where white is slightly better due to sort of the weakness of the square and the pawn on d5, right? I mean, there is a bunch of games by young Karpov, and this is exactly one of them. This is Karpov-Vaganyan from Skopje 1976. But let's just try and do it in slow motion. So I'm claiming that bishop to d3 is very, very important. In the game, we will see that after bishop e2, black plays the very strong move knight to f6. But in this position, white can exploit almost tactically, you could argue. He can play the move queen to e2 and give a check. And this is kind of unpleasant. Of course, we can play queen e7, but if we exchange queens and have an Isolani, we are basically making the statement that it's a drawable ending, but the fun is not there anymore, right? I mean, we are hoping for attacking chances, and for attacking chances, the queen is somewhat integral. So the very obvious move, I would argue, is the move bishop e6, but then it runs into immediate problems of knight d4, actually threatening to take on e6. Sometimes you could sacrifice a pawn like this, but I think in this exact position, it's too much, and white can just castle and have a healthy extra pawn. So after bishop d3, well, it actually becomes somewhat unpleasant, exactly because of knight f6, queen e2 check. But I think for many, it will be very difficult to grasp that after, well, bishop to d3, it actually is kind of in the way of this pawn, right? While with the bishop on e2, you're controlling the d4 square even more. It looks very logical putting the bishop on e2, but it's actually a quite considerable mistake, I would argue. So Jobova plays the move knight to f6, castles, and now he plays h6. The way I was doing things would be to castle in this kind of positions. At first sight, it looks like, okay, it's inviting the pin, and that is, of course, what Jobova was trying to prevent. But black can just play the move h6 here. You can take on f6. I'm going to take back. Queen takes d5. You have won a pawn. It's hard to argue against that. But surprisingly, black has not just pleasant compensation here. I think the computer says black is just flat out better. I think a possible line could be, let's say, bishop d3, bishop e6, queen e4, threatening mates on g7, and we go g6. And Well, it reminds me a little bit of, at some point I had a training session in Belarus really long time ago with the strong grandmaster and coach Rustemov preparing for an important tournament for me. And we were discussing certain positions. And at some point we had a position where, he said he thought, well, it was promising for white. I told him, well, black has an extra pawn. And he said, yeah, I know that. I can calculate too. But I think the initiative is actually that strong. And this is the same here. It's so hard for me not to look at the position and say, well, white has an extra pawn and no particularly weaknesses. But for a computer, it's easy. Rooks comes to d8 and e8. And, well, the queen on e4 is a weakness. You'll have to start running backwards. And, well, of course, we can all count. White has an extra pawn. But the initiative seems to be more important than that. And no, I mean, if you don't believe me, turn on an engine and try to defend. You're not really going to succeed. I mean, maybe you will only be slightly worse. But it is quite fascinating for me that while this looks like a decently healthy position, a pawn up, black actually has a major initiative here. Perhaps the knight on b3 is misplaced and things like that. And of course, also the pair of bishops is strong. But I thought this is a very interesting concept. Going back after h6, another thing that really impressed me was that after the move bishop h4, you are just happily going to play the move g5. I mean, no fear of weakening your king or anything, because after bishop g3, you're going to jump to e4 like this. I mean, well, if you get the chance, you'll go knight c6 and f5, and this bishop at g3 is going to be in trouble. So a reasonable move could be bishop e5 here, but even something like this, knight c6, bishop d4, takes, queen to d6. We're just better with black. You can say I have an isolated pawn. I'm not going to disagree. You can say that the pawn here is going to be weak. It's also the case, but pair of bishops, space, initiative, it actually outweighs it. I would say this bishop on b6 is pointing in the right direction. It's important, or it's interesting to understand that black is just better here. But these things made a huge impression on me, and this general concept of Yobova, I'm a huge fan of. But he plays h6, nothing particularly wrong with that, and his game goes beautifully from here. I just wanted to sort of make the point that bishop g5 is less of a threat than he actually thinks. Anyway, so normal development, and like this. The author makes a point here. He says that black is slightly better here, and he's right. I hope it will be a little bit surprising, right? What are the weaknesses in white position? Well, not really there, but they are there to some extent as well. This one perhaps is pointing towards f2. The knight is going to jump to e4, and perhaps reminding us of the first game, Husman Aronian. A huge problem for white is that he is solid, but he has really nothing reasonable to do here. I mean, well, you can put a rook on d1, and then you can start thinking about what am I going to do next. But if you play rook e1, you weaken the f2 pawn. There's no reasonable way to sort of develop in a positive way. I will say that there's no relevant pressure against the pawn on d4. The knights on b3 and f3, well, they're both pointing toward the d4 square. But if they go there, I mean, as a minimum, black can take twice and the Isolani disappears. White simply lacks something positive to do. Having said that, he shouldn't do something negative, and that's what he does here. He plays the move h3, which actually makes his structural weaknesses on the king side worse. I think the author says that in this position, you should play something like rook d3, and after knight e4, you go rook e1, you start attacking the knight on e4, and after something like queen f6, bishop e3, bishop c7, black has a very pleasant position, and well, the white rooks are, not at all aggressively placed, they're played passively, but at least you're defending quite reasonably. The game came to a much, much quicker conclusion. So rook e8 happened, he played h3, knight jumps to e4, knight to d4. This has, of course, the advantage of sort of making this bishop a little bit worse. There's no direct pressure against f2 anymore, right? No doubt black could start taking on d4 if he just wanted to have a fine position, but Yobava has much more ambitious plans, obviously. So he plays queen to f6, and after bishop e3, it perhaps looks like you have consolidated a bit. But on the contrary, the move h3, which was designed to prevent bishop g4, allows this very, very cute tactic. So bishop takes h3. It's a somewhat typical tactic in a way that, well, it blasts hole to the king, and also it's gonna exploit at times the queen on c2 could be undefended. Maybe that sounds weird, but we will see it here. So he takes, queen g6 check. If you go king to h1 now, then there is this simple win. You take on d4, and now you take on d4 again, and he can't take back because of knight d3 check, and the queen is gonna drop. So this means after queen g6, he is forced to go to h2. So black gives a check, white goes king h1, knight takes d4. If you take with the pawn or the bishop, we have knight g3 winning the queen again, so this is forced. And now this very nice move, queen to d6. This threatens mate on h2. You can't run away with the king. You go to g2, it's just going to be checkmate on h3 when the king goes to f3, right? If you're going to go f4, well, then it's very simple. It's knight g3 check, and this bishop is going to drop afterwards. So there's no way other than defending the mating threat like this. But now you can play queen to e6, and there's no reasonable way of defending it. If you go, I would say, king to g2, it's check, the king has to go back, and then it's knight g3. So if you look at it here, the only way of defending is knight to g1. But now it becomes a very, I think, funny and beautiful maneuver. You sort of start zigzagging with the queen. So you go queen e5, if f4, well, we have the same trick as before, as knight g3 check, and this bishop is going to fall. So they have to play knight f3, and now we play queen f5. And we have zigzagged our queen to f5, where it not only attacks here, but it also attacks the queen. And this basically means that you can't go knight g1, because then, well, now we have knight g3 picking up the queen, so they have to go king g2, and after queen g6 check, if you go king h1, then knight g3 check is the usual way, and after queen g6, knight g5, I think the author gives bishop d8, followed by bishop takes g5, and that's completely fine. I'm sure that h takes g5 or something else is also completely winning. A brilliant game by Jobava, in my opinion. I really would like you to pay attention to the move knight f6, or, well, by sort of by logic, that bishop e2 is actually quite a mistake, because knight f6 can happen and become a very strong structure for black. Actually, it's not so much the bishop being on d3, it's rather that with the bishop on d3, you have the possibility to throw a spanner in the works with queen e2. So I would rather say that the general image I would like to take with you is that something like, well, this, let's say, that just this sort of pure logical development is actually very, very pleasant for the Isolani. I think also, if I remember correctly, it was Karpov who made it in one of his books. He said that the Isolani against the pawn on c3, or rather the pawn on d4 against c6, is typically very promising because of this diagonal with the bishop. Okay, this was like this, right? But having the pawn on e3 at least makes this bishop somewhat worse. I think this is part of the explanation. But of course, a huge part of it is also that the knight is on f6, and the knight of f6, of course, is a positive piece. The knight on e7, as we have seen often in the French, it goes there because it's forced to, not because it likes to be there. So I like to finish this game with this exact position, because I think there is a lot to learn and to be understood from exactly this position. We're going to finish off the chapter on Isolani with a very nice game played in France in 2011. It's Etienne Bacrot against Romain Edouard. I really like the game because it's such a typical Isolani battle. I mean, white is, taking all the energy in his position and pouring it against the white, sort of the black king. And black is doing his best to sort of thwart white's plan and to do typical counterplay. But this game is going to be decided in the middle game, which typically means it goes well for white. But I think our conclusion by now is that an Isolani heavily favors the one playing against it if it comes to an end game. But in the middle game, it's the one with the Isolani who has the attacking chances. But let's jump into details. This position, I really hope it feels somewhat familiar, because we had something very similar in game one of this chapter. But there is quite some differences. Mainly, the white bishop is now on b3. In the earlier game, it was on c4, and there we played, a3 and hit it on a2. Now, sort of because of the earlier phase of this game, the bishop has ended up on b3, and that quite makes some difference in strategy for both players. And first of all, white starts by playing the move bishop to g5. In game one, I was basically saying bishop g5 is a step in the wrong direction, but here it's a step in the right direction. And circumstances change, strategies change. Let's try and explain the basics behind it. Should you attack the bishop immediately with h6? Well, then white can swap on f6 and go d5. Black has to take, but then rook e1 check is annoying, right? We are attacking the king, and the logical move is bishop e6. But then after bishop takes d5, it's going to end up that we're going to take on e6 next, and black is going to have a backward pawn on e6, and he's just going to have an uncomfortable position. So the immediate h6 doesn't really work. But of course, black can just castle, as everybody is doing. But then white continues with the move queen to d2. Should black play h6 and white go bishop h4, then after knight h5, everything would be fine for black. We get the exchange we want, and things starts to, gets much more solid for black's perspective, and it's a step in the wrong direction. But of course, h6 begs the question, can white sacrifice on h6? Well, not fully. If black takes, queen takes, there is, I think, a nice defensive move, knight to g4. It starts attacking the queen here backwards, and, well, if you hide it on h5, we're going to go back to f6, and we keep harassing it. And, if you give a check like this, I can go here, and I can probably do knight h7 next, and somehow it doesn't end up brilliantly for white. So what's the problem with h6? Well, Kramnik showed the solution against Anand. He played the move bishop to f4. I hope it looks a little bit weird for you, right? Why would we put our bishop first to g5, then to return it to f4? We could just have gone there immediately. But the point is that in this position, one has to simply understand that the pawn on h6 is a weakness. Yes, we could not sacrifice immediately, but we would like to sort of bring in more firepower and maybe even back the bishop here, and then bishop takes h6 becomes a very, very realistic theme. There is even a joke that or anecdote rather, that at some point in the chess Olympiad, Rublievsky, playing for the Russian team, he played h6, and while his position maybe was okay, he got sort of obliterated by some sacrifices and lost. And basically at every team mating, his teammates would tell him, I really would assume to his annoyance in the end, that please don't play h6 in this structure. So it almost become like, I don't know, you would call it a meme or something like that at the Russian team there. But poor Rublievsky had to sort of listen to it a lot, but maybe at least it cured him from doing it. And I think that's more or less the general conclusion, that a pawn on h6 here, it would be great if you could see it as a weakness, and a weakness in terms of not immediate, but sort of not long-term either, but in a few moves, suddenly sacrifices there will actually be very uncomfortable. And it's just an unpleasant structure for black, because sacrifices will appear all the time. So people stopped playing h6 in this position. What they then started to sort of do was to play the move knight a5, or that was actually the key move even before this game. This was played a lot in several games between Kramnik with the white pieces and Anand with the black pieces. And they were doing it at some point where they basically was the two major forces in the world of chess. So it was really some high-level debates. It happened at some point when I have just started working for Vichy, so sort of I got into the latter stages of this debate, and My recollection is that I guess at some point we concluded probably we had underestimated how dangerous the white attack was, and we started to look elsewhere. The game continued like this: queen to bishop to c2 back, b5, and then this very nice move, queen to f4. I would also hope that, for you, it looks a little bit slow, right? We go queen d2, we go queen f4, and then we put the queen on h4. Can you really attack as slowly as this? And that's probably also why it took a bit of time for us to realize that it's very dangerous. Yes, you can attack like this. Vichy played the move rook to a7, and after rook a d1, he played the move bishop to b7. And I mean, again, it looks beautiful, right? We have full control of the d5 squares. We have three pieces covering it. Our rook is sort of here, it's helping in this on the 7 file. What can go wrong? Well, what can go wrong is this one, d5. A brilliant move and very typical of the Isolani positions, that this blockade has to be real, and sometimes it's not real, it's deceptive. So I'll show the principal line, which is knight takes d5, then you sacrifice the rook, very nice, takes here, and then the bishop sacrifice, and a check here on h4. Should you go king g6? It's just a trivial mate in 2. So the correct move, of course, is king g8, but after bishop e7, queen e7, knight g5, there's no reasonable way to prevent mate on h7. Well, what you can do is you can sacrifice the queen, but white is going to have a queen against a bishop and a rook, and a close to winning advantage. So it's not like this position is lost or anything for black. I think the best way to defend was something like knight h5 in this position, and should white play queen e4 like this, black can play something like f5, but it does leave an ugly pawn here, right? And I think in the end, the conclusion was that let's try to look elsewhere for some better defenses. That's what Eduard was trying to do. He played the move bishop to d7. A sort of development move you will see quite often in this kind of structure. Macron plays logically. He plays rook a to d1, but actually it seems perhaps a little bit inaccurate, as we will see later. The right move would be rook fe1, as Caruana played, or the even stronger move, I would argue. And after knight a5, queen, bishop c2, knight c4, then you do the Kramnik maneuver again with a huge attack. At least Caruana played like this, and the computer seems to confirm. But rook a d1 is extremely logical, right? I mean, we want to push d5. But the downside is that now black plays knight to a5. It attacks the bishop, which we somehow have to respect. So bishop goes to c2, and knight to c4. Now Macron plays queen e2, which looks quite logical, but queen f4 is actually possible here, but only due to some kind of magic. But it's so beautiful, so let's have a look. Knight takes b2, attacking the rook on d1. That's the whole point. But white can completely ignore this, so he can go queen to h4. This has the threat of, well, let's say if you go knight to d1, right, then we can take here, and it's going to be made on h7 next, so that doesn't work. But there is this strong defensive move h6. White cannot really say, okay, I have start retreating. I mean, he's sacrificed stuff here, and d1 is hanging, so one has to go on. So bishop takes h6. Well, you take back. You can also play, let's say, knight takes d1, but after bishop takes g7, king takes, check, check here. It actually transposes to what we will see in just a second. So bishop takes h6, g takes h6, queen takes h6, knight takes d1. I mean, it would not be surprising if Macron saw this position and thought, I don't really see how to break through here easily. Because if I take on d1, maybe something like, I don't know, rook e8 could happen, and there's no mate immediately. But there's a very brilliant move here. Just to ignore everything on the queen side, but just to play the move to rook e1, right? It seems insane to me to just leave this knight here, but we're really threatening rook e5 and rook g5 mate next. So if you start sort of greedily taking material, well, what are you going to do in this position? Well, you have to stop rook g5 mate, right? Funnily, there is one way to stop it. It's not sufficient, but at least it's a little bit comical and nice. You can play the move queen to a5. And when white, I mean, if knight rook g5, you can take it. So, well, of course, we will take a queen for free, but then you can sort of at least block the rook like this. It's still better for white, so he's expected to win the game. I just thought that, well, queen a5 is such a funny move that it deserves to be mentioned also. But of course, the main thing is this incredible tactical resource, just ignoring everything and switching the rook and giving mate. It would have been an insanely beautiful thing. But the game became much more murky. So after knight c4, Bacro unfortunately didn't go to f4. He played the move queen to e2. Edouard, well, I would say, I mean, he could maybe even have played more bravely here. And actually, in this kind of structures, sometimes you have to be brave, because by being brave, you're trying to disrupt as much as possible. Because, well, if he becomes too passive, suddenly, well, white will get his initiative for free in a way. Knight takes b2 would be a move. It looks like rook b1 traps the knight, which is technically true. But then you can play rook c8 and start counterplay against this one at the same time as the knight will escape to c4. So this actually works. It's, of course, possible to regain a pawn like this, but that's not really what you want. I guess rook c8 or bishop c6 is decent for black. So white would maybe have to play something like rook c1, and there is definitely attacking chances like this. I mean, you go knight e5 and so on and so forth, but still the white position has been disturbed a little bit, I would argue. So taking on b2 would actually have been a very, very cool move. Edouard went rook c8, and now Bacro played the move bishop to b3. Quite often, you cannot really, well, go back there, because black could just play the move knight a5, right, and attacking here, and that would generally be annoying. And should we go bishop c2? Well, knight c4 for a start is just a repetition. But circumstances have changed a little bit, and here, well, white can push d5. And generally, should you take on b3, a very typical trick, you don't waste time taking back, but you interpolate aggression, which is d6 here. And this leaves black in a very difficult spot. I mean, b3 is hanging, and let's say you go knight a5. There is this very, very nice little trick, knight to d5, and, well, it attacks here. You can't take back because this one is hanging, and basically, I mean, it's gonna be very horrible. Well, queen d8, well, I've just explained the very, very basic takes. You threaten the rook like this. And when the rook sort of sidestep here, well, knight e5 is crushing. It attacks here, but it also threatens mate on the g7 square. So game over immediately. So bishop b3 here is a nice move. It attacks this one, and we saw knight a5 is not great. So b5 happens, also quite logically, sort of fortifying the knight on c4, right? Bacro continues knight e5. Still, he's sort of dissolving the b6 square, the c4 square. The knight drops back to b6, and white goes rook fe1. I thought this is an interesting position to pause on, because it's a very typical position in a way, right? I mean, black's position, black's knights are both covering this square, and to say that all pieces are in ideal squares is maybe a little bit too much. Maybe we would like to have the bishop on b7, but actually the bishop on d7 is also quite useful. A very typical move would to play bishop e8. I hope it looks a little bit passive for you, but it somehow defends the f7 pawn, and knight takes f7 starts being much less of a threat. It's not a direct threat here anyway, but it's a typical way of doing it. And maybe next, we will play knight f to d5, and somehow we will start trying to solidify things, and sometimes it ends up decently well for black. And it's not that easy making a useful move for white. Well, there is several useful moves. I think we could consider rook d3, to swing it somewhere over here at some point and attack. I guess also, I mean, queen to f3 to h3 later to play something like bishop c2 would also be quite normal. But one of the computer's favorites move is a very, very different one. It plays the move h4 here, and I think also Kramnik was doing similar things. For instance, in a World Championship match game against Kasparov in 2000, yeah, 2000 exactly, when they had their match in London. And well, maybe you would like to, push it a little bit further if possible. If you get it to h6, it would somewhat undermine the structure. But also, you just like having it there in a way. Why should the pawn not be useful on h4? It sort of also guards this bishop a little bit. It makes it uncomfortable for black. I think computer line is something like h6, but then we take, and we can start pushing d5 already. And somehow, well, when this diagonal opens and the bishop starts pinning the f7 pawn, suddenly there might be tricks like knight g6. So computer does something like this. It takes, knight takes, and well, if you start taking on d5, I guess this kind of knight we can take with the rook, and something like knight g6 will happen at some point. So computer goes bishop takes e5, we take on b6. Now this nice interpolation of bishop h2 check, takes, queen takes b6, and something like queen g4. And white is just pleasantly better, right? Our bishop is good, the black bishop is bad, and we got rid of our Isolani, and black can only hope to somehow limit the damage and draw in a tedious defense. So I just felt that it was a good moment to mention that bishop e8 is a typical defensive move, but also to flig in that in these kind of structures, quite often you do actually play h4 here. But back to the game. Here, well, if b4, then d5 becomes similar like before. I mean, again, black tries to disturb, but he's not coordinated well enough for it. So in the game, Edouard played the move h6. Now, again, it becomes strange. Here, probably bishop to h4 is the right move. Well, if you go, well, you can't really go knight h5, right? And if you go knight d5, then tactics like this actually seems to work quite well. And we attack the bishop. You can follow up by this, followed by d5, and white is better. So, I mean, we can see how, it becomes very tough to be generalistic, right? I'm telling you, well, with white, don't play bishop g5, then say, no, actually you should play bishop g5. Then I'm telling you, play bishop g5, but don't go to h4. But now you actually have to go to h4. It's complicated, and circumstances are going to prevail. That's just how high-level chess is, and that's what also makes it fun. Well, speaking of fun, Bacrot took on h6 in this position. Also very typical. We saw an earlier example with colors reversed where Jobava was doing it. Here, however, it's not bad, it's not good, it's just a mess. So take back, rook goes to d3, and I think now maybe, well, you could play b4 immediately, but well, he plays king to h8. It's quite reasonable way. I mean, the h6 pawn is weak, so getting the knight g8 defense looks reasonable. Things ends incredibly nice for Bacrot here, but realistically speaking, he should have played the move d5, and if takes something like this, and just trying to swap down to a position that's slightly better for white, but nothing more than that, according to the computer. Bacrot, he gets rewarded for bravery, but actually it is quite dubious. So knight g8, and well, you're a piece down, you have to keep attacking. So he goes d5. Edouard puts his knight on c4. It forces the exchange like this, and after rook d4, black was falling a bit short of time, and well, it's a very logical result that white wins here. He puts pressure, he sacrifices, it's dangerous. Black spends a lot of time defending, and he goes wrong at some point. He plays bishop c5, which, unfortunately for him, loses immediately. The right move would have been queen to e8, sort of getting out of. I mean, there was pressure against the queen here, but on e8 it's much safer. In this position, it turns out that there is no reasonable direct blow, right? I mean, if we take an e6, now the bishop is unpinned and can just take back. I mean, do we play d6? That's well, it makes very little sense. The bishop can go to, let's say, g5 and attack the queen. The best shot would be something like knight e4 and kind of hope for the best. Black is better, but not winning according to the computer. But, well, this is how practical chess is. I mean, you gamble and sometimes it goes well. Edouard played bishop c5. It's very logical in terms of, I mean, this rook on d4 is causing a lot of harm in the file, and now it's attacked, and if it moves, there's no good square in the d file. Unfortunately, there's a tactical problem. So white goes d takes e6, black takes the rook, and now queen takes. The problem is that after something like bishop takes e6, we can just play this, and it's a double check, right? So black has to go here, and we can just take the queen next, and it resigns. So after queen takes d4, black has to go queen f6, but e d7, rook cd8. Materially, you can argue it's not that disastrous for black. Of course, he's an exchange up, but white has a strong pawn. That could be debated, but the problem is, after the strong move rook to e3, there's no reasonable way to defend against rook f3, and disaster is going to happen on f7. Yeah, I mean, well, if rook f3 happens, queen d7, you can play rook takes f7, and if takes, knight takes, I mean, I don't know, let me just show it like this, I guess. Something like this, takes here, due to the pin, you cannot take back, and after this, we are just gonna exchange, and, well, this is resigns, obviously. So, poor Edouard tried the move knight e7, but after rook f3, knight to c6, well, he tries to generate some kind of counterplay, hoping that in this position he can still play on a little bit. But Bacro is not that friendly. He plays knight takes f7. You cannot take back with the queen because of the pin, so rook f7 is forced. But after queen takes f6 takes here, it's just gonna end up with an ending where, I mean, these are gonna drop. Sure, black is gonna win the pawn on d7, but everything else is falling, and we're talking the region of like 2-3 pawns down and ending, and Edouard, of course, resigned. I really think this was a great game because it's such a typical Isolani struggle, right? I mean, white tries to pour all his energy into an attack, even including a sacrifice of a piece. And black, well, does his best to sort of annoy white's concept in several ways. And objectively, it's a battle that sort of swings back and forth. But maybe we get the impression that the practical chances are on the attacking side. But we will see in a couple of games later that is not necessarily always the case. But I really like that it sort of gives this struggle situation, that it's two very different strategies fighting against each other, and also that well, some model games will just be perfect in the sense that they just tell one very, very direct story, while this one is much more a back and forth battle, which most chess games are. So I really hope you found it interesting and sort of useful as well. We have managed to sort of create this general rule that isolated pawn, it favors the attacker. So, well, the one with the isolated pawn will win the middle games, while the one who is fighting against the isolated pawn will win the ending. Unfortunately, things are not that simple. And, well, this game we're gonna see now, it's Vichugov against Bologan from 2012. Is very much a counterexample, because Vichugov, he's gonna play against the isolated pawn, and he's gonna play a brilliant middle game and just to win. And yeah, I think the usual argument, chess is difficult, and well, exceptions to the rules is what makes it interesting. Anyway, let's start with this position. It's a fairly typical 4 queen c2 Nimsi Indian middle game. But it's something that has fallen completely out of fashion for the last 10-15 years. But at some point, this was an extremely interesting structure. There would be Kramnik games. There would even be a Kasparov-Karpov sort of intellectual duel here. But just because of the sort of appearance of a a specific concept for black against this 4 queen c2 Nimzo Indian, this has completely fallen off the radar. So sort of structurally, it's not really interesting anymore. Not because it's not an interesting structure, but just because black can avoid it and white will never get it, really, from a theoretical perspective. But for understanding chess, this position is quite interesting. I think what springs to mind, well, white has a pair of bishops. This is more or less the whole point of playing this 4 queen c2 to Nimzo. And black, what does black have in return? You can argue an extra center pawn, but they are kind of passive. So when they go forward, they're going to be exchanged. It's not really sort of the main point. Perhaps I would argue that what black has is some lead in development, right? White still has pieces to develop, but also if white was fully developed, white would just be somewhat better because the pair of bishops and the more space. So the question is, can black sort of act in any way to well, attack white before he managed to consolidate? And Bologan gives it a shot. He plays the move d5. I guess this might start threatening perhaps e5 followed by d4 and some tactics. So, well, Vichugov takes, and Bologan takes back with the pawn, and then, well, there is already a threat to e3, which is sort of a weakness, and then Vichugov goes bishop to f2. At first sight, this looks pretty promising for black, in my opinion. The lead in development is quite significant. But it turns out that here, not at all. White is just better. I think there's a lot of similarities to the game we saw Husman-Aronian earlier, but there is also quite some differences. And one major difference is that Aronian had kept all the minor pieces on the board, while here there has been an exchange of a black squared bishop for a knight. And probably having only 3 pieces instead of 4 means that white actually have sufficient space. I mean, this bishop is going to go to e2, and there's castling, and there's no sort of superfluous knight in the way. So I think having less pieces seems to help white massively here. It's still surprising for me that the black initiative is not really functioning. I mean, Bologan does it very logically. He plays the move knight to c5. It has the threat of knight e6 followed by d4 and trouble in the e-line because of, well, the king and the queen is sort of in the same line, but it doesn't really matter. Bishop e2 happens, knight e6, rook d2. And now sort of black's initiative comes to sort of a standstill. Bologan just tries to grab space with a6 and b5, but it kind of falls short. The logical move perhaps would be to try and go d4, takes knight f4. It's very logical, right? You get an attacking knight on f4, and you get a bishop here attacking towards the king side. But after short castling, there seems to be no reasonable way to follow it up. I mean, white is threatening something like rook e1, bishop f1 consolidating, and it's going to be a decently healthy pawn extra. And, well, with that, one suddenly starts to understand that the black initiative here is kind of temporary. There's no reasonable way to, you know, force things through. I mean, I guess you can make the argument that actually all black's pieces are in an ideal situation. I mean, how would you improve things, right? Black is as set up as it's possible, and white has not even consolidated yet. If that is not enough for the black attack to succeed, well, how are you going to manage, right? So there is apparently something fundamentally wrong with the black's dynamics here. They are just not sufficient. Bologan tries a6. It's actually the same concept as Aronian to some extent. Castling b5. But now rook fd1, and, well, black goes rook c8, and queen b1 happens. If we remember the Aronian-Husman game, there was bishops on e1 and e2. But having it on f2, I think, makes a major difference. It protects the indeed weak pawn on e3, but also it allows to have the pawn on f3. And the pawn on f3 is very relevant in terms of it protects the e4 square, which means that, well, there's not this knight jump possible anymore. Actually, well, both these knights are just very passive. There's no reasonable prospects. I think it reminds me also a little bit about some kind of argument Suba, a famous Romanian / English grandmaster, was making. It was about a different structure, but he basically was arguing that in a structure where one player has all his pieces in the ideal situation and the opponent does not. If the one having it in ideal situation cannot break through, it favors the opponent in the sense that, well, you can see here, white will continue bishop f1, then maybe knight e2, eyeing these kind of squares, and you can start switching to the c line. It's pretty easy to suggest natural moves improving white's positions, while black's position, I really think it's set up as well as it can. But it's set up as well as it can, and it can really do nothing. So this is a situation where the pawn on the isolated pawn is really just a weakness, because it's not going to be pushed forward. There's no reasonable way to do it. And basically black is just left with a very sad position. Bologan tries some pseudo activity, knight c5, jumps here. But it leads nowhere. I think computers suggest a move a4 here, which is also quite reasonable. But knight e2 is extremely logical, right? We are eyeing the sort of square in front of the pawn to really blockade it. Black tries to find some refuge in exchanging a set of rooks, but something like this happens now. Well, you cannot even take on e3 because just rook e1 makes a pin, right? So it's a very sad position here. He tries queen e5, and now another nice maneuver, rook to d3, rook to c3. And after, I think, rook e8, queen c1, he's getting ready to play b3. He's defending the pawn on a3, so the knight can't take it. And then the rook is just going to penetrate on c7. I think it doesn't matter so much anymore, but it's a beautiful game, so let's just finish it. Knight f8. b3, knight b6. Now we can see that the rook is protecting the e3 pawn, so the bishop doesn't have to stay passive, but can start sort of having some positive influence. Queen f6, rook c7, attacking the bishop on b7, and well, there is a slight repetition of moves here, but now he puts the queen on d2, and after queen a5, everything starts to dropping, and everything is solid here. So it was game over very, very shortly. I think Bologan tried to sacrifice a piece like this, but it did not work at all, just e4, and the queen is not coming to d3, and I think the game was like this, queen d2, but it really doesn't matter anymore. For me, a very impressive game by Vichugov, and well, I really like this position because it improves my understanding of chess. It looks promising for black, the way I see it, simply because, I mean, you find the king is stuck in the center, white is not really developed. It's easy to point at weaknesses. But here you start to see that playing against an Isolani, at times the position can be very solid, and we just end up getting stuck with the Isolani, as we saw here, that when things evolved to here, there was just no way of getting on further, and well, then everything got pushed backwards. I think a lot of it had to do with that white has the pair of bishops, that black has given away, the bishop on d6 would normally sort of be attacking in this direction, and also the fact that I was telling you that having only 3 minor pieces instead of 4 minor pieces probably helped the defender, or at least, well, it's not like white is the defender here, but he's fighting against the isolated pawn. It's actually white who's attacking, but in a more long-term way, right? So black just lacks the initiative, and then we see that the isolated pawn can actually be a severe weakness. So I think a great example selected here by the author. This is a very interesting game. It's a crushing attacking victory, and the two players is Magnus Carlsen and Wang Yue. Magnus, perhaps the greatest player of all time, facing the incredible solid player Wang Yue. That it ends up with an attacking victory perhaps is not so surprising, but that Magnus is going to be swept off the board, on the contrary, doesn't really fit the roles I was describing. But Wang Yu is quite a strong player, and he was maybe perhaps hindered by his solidity. But as we will see here, when he attacks, he does it very, very well. Also, this game is from 2009. I mean, I have been working with Magnus for more than 11 years, and I don't really like to show a game he loses. But I guess something from his youth he will live with, and I think we all know now what an incredible player Magnus is. Anyway, let's skip over to chess. I'm starting the game a little bit early. White has just played the move rook to c1 here. And the reason I started here is that from my perspective, it would be very tempting to play the move e4. For me, it just looks, doesn't black get a very good French, right? We get control of the center and we have sort of a spatial advantage, and also we play a French without our bad bishop. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. White will just go queen to d1, and after bishop e7, an exchange of pawns like this, and the queen to c2. This position is just much better for white. I think the positional threat is putting the queen on c7, getting rid of the queens, but of course also just controlling the c file is fine. But in general, white is gonna have easy development, and should the queen comes off, it's just going to be a very pleasant ending with a pair of bishops and also this knight on a4. Well, with the c-pawns exchanged and the c-file under white's control, this is just going to be a strong knight that is controlling and attacking in this direction, as we mentioned. It's just a much, much better position for white. So in this position, actually the move e4 would be a strategic blunder. Wang Yu plays a nice move, bishop to d6. Now the problem for white is it's not so simple to make a decent development move. I mean, if you go bishop e2, then e4 suddenly starts trying to trap the white queen, so that doesn't work. What Magnus chooses to do is that he took on d5 and then on e5. And, well, now knight e5, queen d1, we basically have our Isolani position. I think I will jump a move forward and then start to talk in this position. White has just a pair of bishops, right? And he has a very solid position. As well as in the previous game I spoke about, having exchanged a set of minor pieces probably sort of helps the person who is fighting against the Isolani, because the Isolani generally counts on activity, while the one fighting it wants solidity. But there is some major differences from the previous game. For a start, the black knights are pretty well placed, especially knight on f6 can jump to e4. In the previous game, I think we saw that white could play something like f3 and control this square, but here it doesn't work, because that would really weaken the dark squares, especially a knight would end up on g3. And I think, as well as we will see in the game, the knight here, will go to g6 and to h4 and keep some attack. Also, if black is limited to having one bishop, I think having this bishop is considerably better. It points in the direction of h2, and if you can sort of get the queen in front of it, let's say bishop b8, queen d6, it's gonna be some kind of mating threats, especially as white doesn't have a knight on f3 defending in that direction. So there's a lot of details in black's favor. That being said, I don't think black is better here. It's just the previous game we saw, it was very grim for black. Here, actually, the counterplay is real, and the position is much more complicated. Wang Yu plays the move a5, just sort of, covering the pawn on b4, I would say. Magnus's next moves are a little bit interesting. I guess that the logical follow-up would be castling, but then, well, the king would be committed to castling, and maybe black could start attacking the h2 square immediately. So Magnus plays the move rook to c2, and after queen e7, bishop c1. So he's trying to reroute this bishop to b2, and I guess the rook on c2, you can also argue, is pretty ideally placed. It's keeping, an eye on the open file, but also is, defending in this direction. Maybe it's a bit vague how it's defending there, but I think it is a kind of useful square, and it's a talented way to reorganize by Magnus, no doubt. The game continued rook a8, bishop b2, and now Wang Yu puts the knight to g6. I mean, what I'm trying to show with the colors here, that in general, the knight on e5 look ideally placed, right? It's in the middle of the board. But it somehow it blocks this bishop's direction towards the king a little bit. And also, well, when he puts it on g6, it starts jumping in the direction of h4, starting to, touch some critical squares in front of the white king side. I guess for that reason, Magnus chooses to castle here. I mean, it's well, then at knight h4 won't happen with tempo, right? And also, I mean, Magnus has kind of clarified the structure on his queen side, so it's the logical way to proceed. Wang Yu goes knight e4 next, and I think, I mean, his attacking prospects looks rather nice. All his pieces, or the light pieces, are on excellent squares, and from an attacking perspective, this knight on a4 is looking quite badly. However, of course, this debate we also had previously, that if all the pieces are put in ideal squares and cannot really progress, then it can also come to a very grim halt, and your position just turns out to be sour. But here, this is not so much the case, and I think particularly the weakness of the h2 square is relevant. I mean, well, the bishop will back to b8, and the queen will go to d6, and it's going to point at the white king. And when this happens, well, white has to make some kind of weakness to protect that. So black can actually do something positive here, and Magnus has to act. His next move is bishop to d4. To me, it looks somewhat suspicious, but the computer quite likes it. Well, part of it is this greed concept of going here and trying to win this pawn on a5. It strikes me as incredibly greedy, but it is a reasonable plan. And of course, if the black threats are not sufficient, then why not? Yeah, I mean, well, again, my intuition doesn't really like it in a way, and it ends up badly for black. But the computer thinks it's acceptable. So who am I to argue against modern artificial intelligence, right? Wang Yu's next move is knight to h4. I think reasonable. I also like it because it's a multi-purpose move. I mean, the threat to the g2 pawn, or the potential threat to the g2 pawn and the king's position, is easy to see, but also sort of the backdrop to f5, starting to attack the bishop on d4, I like a lot. I mean, if you get to play knight f5, and well, then white has to consider moving the bishop. If he moves the bishops, maybe we can push d4 ourselves as a sacrifice at some point. It's a little bit vague, but multi-purpose moves is always very, very nice, I think. It could be possible to play the move bishop to b6 now, but I think the author suggests that even in this position, then bishop b8 is actually quite reasonable. And even a position like this, the computer says that simply the threats like here to h2 is sufficient counterplay. Something like, I think the author gives this line, and just, well, like this, knight to f5, and bishop comes to a7. This pawn on e3 is so weak. I guess we can also argue there's a weakness here, that this is sort of a quite equalist position where black is doing surprisingly fine. But it's no way forced, it's more illustrative, I would argue. So, well, bishop b6 was possible, but Magnus, he goes for a more sort of sane approach. He plays the move bishop to d3. I think quite reasonably that, it's not like he wants to take on e4 immediately, but he might want to take on e4 at some point. And I think someone suggested that a factor of bishops being better than knights can be that, well, it's the bishops who gets to choose when to exchange. That's, of course, not always true, but in this scenario it is that it's not like the idea is to play bishop takes e4 immediately, but who knows, we might do it at some point, and it's a reasonable defensive resource to have. Wang Yu backs down to f5, and maybe it's his sort of natural, somewhat solidifying instincts that comes to play here. I think the author says bishop b8 could have been a stronger move, but knight f5 is fine. It attacks also the bishop here, right? Bishop b6 happens, and then rook to b8. Now, I think the author says that maybe queen to f3 was a better move, somehow having the queen around on the king side to try and defend like this. But Magnus decides to, well, now is the time to make this exchange. He plays bishop takes e4, queen takes back, and then the rook to d2. It strikes me as sort of, young, fearless Magnus, right? I mean, he's really playing the position like he's trying to refute Black's concept. He's pushing his, position quite far, right? I mean, he's put a knight on a4 and a bishop on b6, but he's having pressure against the pawn on d5, and basically he says that, well, there's no reasonable way that you can sort of break down my position. And, well, if I win the d5 pawn, or if you have to start retreating your knight to e7, suddenly I'm just going to be better. And while, I mean, I would say that this weakness, you can argue, is permanent, while the weakness of these two pieces, they can actually be regrouped and become better. So it is a very cool thing Magnus is doing. It's perhaps useful optimism, but there is a lot of logic behind it, and it takes genius play to refute it. Wang Yue plays rook takes b6 here. Interesting move. Well, of course, Magnus has to take back, and then the move queen to e5. Now, well, we can see that there's a threat of made in one. The correct defense now would be to play g3. The idea is that now I think knight takes g3 is the move, and I mean, if you take it, I would assume that well, we can do something like this, and as a minimum we have stuff like this, and the knight is going to fall on b6. Well, we'll also pick up h3 with check, perhaps if you go to king h1 and something like this. It's not very good. The computer says knight takes d5, and this position actually is not as bad for white as one might think. The king will, find some safety on e2, especially after the queen going to f3 first. I hope that at sight you would think black should be better here, but actually this is not really the case, because somehow, well, this knight on d5 is strong, the rook is going to be protected by the king on e2, and so on and so forth. It's actually not too bad. But Magnus is a more ambitious player. He plays the move rook to e1. Wang Yue gives a check here, as a typical motive, gives a check on h1, and then he can take on g2. Now, well, again, computer says king d3 would be a better move here, and somehow black is not necessarily winning. But Magnus plays, I would say, a more logical move. He plays the move rook takes d5. And for me, this is just a completely random position. It's not obvious who is better at all by sight. And basically it comes down to Wang Yue playing an amazing move in a couple of moves. So I think Magnus can really be excused for it. But anyway, I'm trying my best to defend my boss, right? Knight g3 check, king d3, and now they move bishop to c7. Well, it threatens on b6, and let's say the knight cannot really comfortably go here, because then, well, the rook is going to hang on d5, right? So that's a clever move. So basically, f takes g3 is possible, bishop takes b6, and now king to c4. Actually, for our general understanding of Isolani, I should have stopped long ago. I just so much wanted to show this position. Some point, my dream is that when I retire as an active coach, I want to write a book, or even better, a chessable course about king safety. And well, this could be one of the examples here. That I mean, the logical move would be to play queen e4 check, right? King goes to b5, then you would play rook b8, threatening some kind of deadly discovery. But then after the move king a4, white just has a perfectly safe king. Well, I think the problem is that, let's say, something like this, I guess we can just defend it with a rook here, and then the queen will come to d3 and start defending it. And, well, this just seems to work quite well. It's astonishing that a king here can actually be extremely safe, but it is in this example, simply because there is so few pieces capable of attacking it, and, well, you see these ones. I should probably rather put them red. There's just no way they can attack the king on a4, right? And, well, I think modern chess has more examples like that. You will see a bunch of top games where, especially in some kind of Italian structure, it's a lot about you sacrifice a pawn or two, but you will have a safer king. And it's a very interesting topic for me. Anyway, I'm getting you completely distracted from the isolated pawn scenario that we are discussing. But here, after king c4, actually Wang Yu understands it brilliantly. He knows that the white plan is to do this with the king, and he decides to stop it with a very, very good move. He plays rook to b8, and basically, well, Magnus goes king b5, but now there is a discovered check. Okay, maybe d8 was a better square, it doesn't really matter. And after this, somehow white's position is kind of undefendable because the king is now stuck in the middle, while if the king was on a4, it would be winning. Well, not exactly here because a2 would be hanging. Anyway, I got too passionate about one of my favorite subjects. I'm sorry about that. Worst case, you could skip over it. But going back to the Isolani, I hope this was an interesting and unusual example, right? That, I mean, the pieces are sort of put in a kind of weirdish situation with the knight here, but generally material distribution should be very pleasant for white, but there is a lot of compensating factors, and it led to a very interesting struggle where I would say from practical perspective, perhaps black had the better chances, but objectively was kind of equal. Then Magnus became very ambitious, and Wang Yu punished it brilliantly. So, well, despite Magnus losing, I hope you really enjoyed this game too. The author rounds off this chapter of the book with sort of something he calls final comment. And when I saw this position, I thought, yeah, this is a really good choice of a final comment to show that even in positions like this, where the Isolani gets completely blocked, black could still be doing very fine. His intended move is to move d4, and it turns out beautifully for black in the game. But, well, the tough things for having to show books that are like quite some years old is that modern Indians will come up with good refutations now and then. And in this position, actually, white has some very interesting tries. The game goes knight to e1. It's extremely logical, right? We're gonna exploit that we have this beautiful square where our knight can basically stand and not be disturbed. It looks very nice, but it's very, very stereotypical thinking. Modern computers has much better ideas. The best move, perhaps, is the move b4. I would not even be close to thinking of that in a game. But, well, the idea is that I guess perhaps a4 next could be kind of a threat. And if knight takes b4, this amazing move bishop to g5. Yeah, what should I say? If you go bishop e7, then rook b1 starts becoming quite a relevant threat with problems in the b file, and also bishop takes f6 existing as a threat. So the logical move would be after bishop to g5 to take on c2, but then white can even interpolate taking on f6, and after gf6, queen takes c2. Momentarily it's a sacrifice, but I mean, there has been done considerable damage to the king's side, right? Maybe the queen can go to e4 and do something like that. Maybe also there could be an annoying check, and they will get the d4 pawn back. The computer somewhat prefers white here. It strikes me that that b4 exists. It's just a pretty random freak occurrence, but it's quite interesting. A more human move, but I also quite a lot, is starting with the move a4. That, at least for me, has a little bit more of logic. Maybe there is a threat of a5 next, because a5, should you take it, then the pawn on d4 is gonna hang. But after a4, at side it would look, well, black can just play a5, right? Simply because, well, this sort of interpolation of these two moves, it generally looks to favor black because it stabilizes the queen side. But white has this very nice move in this position, queen to d3. And now the queen will go to b5 and actually starts gonna harassing the queen on b6, and after an exchange, a queen of b5, we take back with the pawn, and both the d4 and the a5 pawn is gonna drop. So this is actually surprisingly unpleasant for black. So this concept of playing a4 here, I have to say I really like. This is a cool idea. Anyway, the game went knight c to e1. Black, develops, so does white, and we get a position like this. And the game went bishop g5, rook fe8. And the author made the relevant point that this is actually already a somewhat better position for black. And I guess it has to do with space. Of course, there is this nice knight on d3, which blocks the pawn. So, I mean, we're not going to be able to sacrifice it. But we don't really have to. We have space, we have basically good square for all our pieces, and I mean, should you start annoying our bishop on e6, we will just happily go to f5 and be happy there. And, well, basically, I think it rounds off with a position where the one with the isolated pawn is actually very fine by general means. It's not like there needs to be some kind of immediate activity. It's just a combination of having, this pawn on d4, I would say, it's not weak. I understand it's an Isolani, but it grabs space, it stops, white from playing something like e3, and, basically there is squares around it. Mainly we have looked at a situation where the Isolani would be somewhat blocked, but here it's blocked further away, and this creates, space, of course, especially the d5 square, but black has a considerable space advantage here and is just better. I forgot the game went something like maybe this, rook fc1, and now knight b4 happened with the complications, but I think the computer says, why not just play the move bishop to e7, and should you go knight f4, again there is the possibility of bishop f5. But the details here doesn't matter so much. It's more the sort of general idea that it's not always that having an Isolani is so bad that you are forced to attack massively. It can also be played in a somewhat positional manner, but mainly when you get even more space, as we got here with a pawn on d4, right? Anyway, we will finish the chapter here. I hope it was interesting to talk and debate the pros and cons of the Isolani, and I really hope that you will try it out in your games, and ideally with both colors. While I think it's very much a stylistic choice which color you prefer in the Isolani. Positional players would probably rather play against it, aggressive players would rather have it, but in an ideal world, one should be capable of doing both. So give it a try from both sides, and I hope I have helped you at least with some decent starting points there. Good luck.